Good afternoon. Hi, I'm Nan Kaplan, and thank you for watching this afternoon. I'm going to speak about the Indian relations at the time of the Mayflower. William Bradford was an orphan in the early years of the separatists in the Scrooby and Canterbury area of England. At the age of 12, he fell ill and sought solace in the Bible and continued with the study of scriptures throughout his life. It was a time of immorality in an agitated world, and he felt the church was leading them away from God. He found William Brewster, who felt they should go back to purity and reject hierarchy. The group wanted to separate from the Church of England and royal authority. King James I ruled by law and order. The separatists needed to leave the country. In 1607, 16 escaped on a boat to Amsterdam, where they expected to settle. But they had difficulties there and moved 22 miles to Leiden, where they were free to worship unmolested. They had many years of peace there, and others had joined them. But their children were becoming Dutch and losing their identity. The separatists decided to move to the New World. After learning about conditions in Virginia in 1618, some members of the Leiden congregation worried that even if they made it to their destination alive, Native Americans would flay their skins and eat their flesh. They were naive in their planning and didn't properly prepare for supplies and arms and weapons to defend themselves against the Indians and rival Europeans. The need for financing led to a joint stock company of the investors, called the adventurers, and the settlers, the planters, thinking that the settlers could send back furs to England. They had heard of great natural riches in North America. The most prominent of the settlers were Samuel Fuller, Edward Winslow, William Bradford, John Robinson, and my ancestor Isaac Allerton, along with many others. Finally, on September 6, 1620, too late in the year, 102 passengers set sail on the Mayflower. The Speedwell, which was to accompany the Mayflower from Southampton, had leakage problems. The two ships returned, and most of her passengers packed onto the Mayflower, which set sail again alone. Half of the 102 passengers were Leiden separatists, including 30 children. The trip was a voyage from hell, with slow progress because of the weather. The animals and passengers were ill. 2 died. On November 9, after 2 months at sea, land was spied, and they realized they were far north of the plan to reach New York. They were off Cape Cod, but moved around the Cape and into Great Bay. Here tensions broke out, and some decided to split when they came ashore. But they finally agreed to combine to preserve the group via the Mayflower Compact. There was nothing in it about voting rights, the Constitution, Bill of Rights, and nothing about how the colony would relate to native people, other than a vague note to convert them to Christianity. There was no time for drafting a solid agreement other than the sparsest framework for self-government. 90% of the men signed. John Carver was elected governor, and the threat had been averted. Bradford wrote later that there were no friends to welcome him, only a wilderness of wild beasts and wild men. They cried out to the Lord. They were running out of water and food, so send out some scouts to explore. They found some graves and storage of corn. The separatists took some of the best things: corn, seeds, baskets, and other belongings. They were hungry, but didn't need to take the other things, demonstrating that they had little respect for the natives. This was the first act of plunder. They were being watched. They sighted some natives at First Encounter Beach. Arrows were cast toward the scouting party, but no one was hurt. These were Nausetts, a tribe of the Wampanoag Nation. The European settlers had been in contact and trading with the natives for a century. but relations had grown tense because of the kidnappings by the explorers. The settlers had heard about savage and brutish men. It was getting cold, so on December 15, 1620, the Mayflower sailed west, ending in Patuxent, which was to become Plymouth Colony. They were ill-equipped, but this was a most hopeful place with fresh water and rich soil. The Native Americans in the area of Plymouth Colony were Wampanoags, who had been there 10,000 years before the Europeans, who had reported abundant, thickly settled native villages with abundant fields. The Pilgrims found fish and fowl, but the region's human inhabitants had disappeared. They had been wiped out by disease, and the village was strewn with bones and skeletons. All had died from a disease the European traders had brought to America, probably viral hepatitis from contaminated food. History does not tell us which disease. It could also have been leptospirosis, smallpox, cholera, malaria, typhoid, or bubonic plague, although the latter would not have survived the Atlantic crossing. Smallpox would have been the most destructive disease. The cultural trait of Native Americans to visit the sick would have added to the spread, which could lead to blindness and scars. The natives prided themselves on appearance, and the resulting skin disfigurement of smallpox would have deeply affected them psychologically. Unable to cope, some committed suicide. Europeans might have been asymptomatic, but passed it on to the natives who did not have immunity. Many tribes experienced great depopulation, averaging 25 to 50% of tribal members. Beginning in 1616, the pestilence took 3 years to exhaust itself. Massasoit, the leader/sachem of the Wampanoag Nation, had held sway over a confederation of as many as 20,000 people, now less than 1,000. Bradford attributed the plague to the good hand of God, who swept away great multitudes of the natives, that he might make room for us. It shattered the Wampanoag sense that they lived in a sense of balance with an intelligible world. The Narragansett, their enemies, had not been affected, so Massasoit's people were in danger of subjection. The separatists had walked into a disaster. Poor nutrition on the crossing had left their health fragile, and they lacked food for the months ahead. They were infected with scurvy and other diseases. They feared the Indians would take advantage of their weakness. The weather had turned bad and people started dying. By spring, 1/2 were dead. During the first months, they saw little sign of Native Americans. A settler had stumbled onto a group of 12 natives, and 2 other settlers had reported stolen tools. They prepared to defend themselves, appointing Miles Standish as military captain, but there was no attack. In mid-March, an Indian man strolled into the settlement and welcomed them in English. This was Samoset, an Abenaki Sagamore from the north, who had learned English from European fishermen. He was now part of the Wampanoag tribe. He asked for beer. They had none. He taught them about the native communities nearby and the kidnappings by Thomas Hunt, explaining that was why the Nausetts had attacked them on the Cape. Samoset told them about the plague at Patuxent. The settlers had felt the epidemic as God's providential preparation for the English. There is none to hinder our possession or to lay claim unto it. This was the beginning of the attitude that caused the white man to take advantage of the natives and their lands. They had a good visit, and Samoset said he would return with some of Massasoit's people. On March 22, the settlers met Squanto and others. After Squanto, known as Tisquantum, meaning rage, and 19 others had been captured by Thomas Hunt at Patuxent, they had been taken to a slave market in Spain to be instructed in the Christian faith. The Spanish church was vehemently opposed to brutality towards Indians. In 1527, Pope Paul III proclaimed, "Indians themselves are true men and should not be deprived of their liberty and reduced to our service like brute animals." Squanto ended up in England, where he learned English and eventually returned across the Atlantic to Newfoundland, where he met Captain Thomas Dermer. Both wanted to return to New England, Dermer for fish and trade, and Squanto for home. In 1619, they sailed back to Patuxent and found all dead. Squanto helped Dermer develop relationships with some native villages. Sailing to Martha's Vineyard, they met Epinow, a former captive, who sensed an opportunity for revenge. Dermer found formerly friendly Hokanakets now bore malice to the English. Dermer's men were attacked and many were slain. European fur traders had relationships with different tribes, which encouraged rivalries and hostilities. There had been many kidnappings of natives by the explorers, and resentments had built up. In 1605, George Weymouth captured 5 Abenaki and ordered them to act as interpreters and navigators. Other kidnappings followed. Edward Harlow in 1611 took 5 natives to exhibit them to crowds in England. In the meantime, John Smith had been mapping the coastline from the St. Lawrence River to Cape Cod, declaring the region New England. He reported rich fishing and human resources who seemed promising and eager to trade. He thought the English could quickly subdue and intimidate the natives, and they could deliver fish and furs back to England. But he in turn condemned Thomas Hunt, saying his treachery among the savages taught the natives to hate the English. He wanted to sell them as slaves. In another episode in 1619, the explorers had lured natives on board ship, promising trade, and mercilessly slaughtered them. Despite all these hostilities, Governor Carver and Massasoit formed an alliance that both sides would gain from. The Pilgrims needed security and food, and the natives needed new allies and wanted trade. These peace terms were kept by both sides during Massasoit's lifetime. Massasoit originally had a dilemma of whether to form an alliance or to drive the settlers out. Squanto urged him to become friends, as the friendship would become a barrier between their enemies, the Massachusetts and the Narragansetts. The Mayflower had returned to England in 1621, leaving the settlers completely on their own without their lifeline. Massasoit had asked Squanto to stay with the settlers and teach them survival skills and show them how to hunt, farm, and fish. He was instrumental in their survival in the Plymouth colony and never left them until he died. The colonists, with fur trading, could pay off the financial debt to their sponsors. John Carver had died in April 1621, and William Bradford was chosen to be governor, with Isaac Allerton as his assistant. Winslow and Hopkins, with Squanto, met with Massasoit to tell him of their taking of the corn from Cape Cod and wanted to make restitution, which they did. They had a good relationship thereafter with the Nausets, and peace generally prevailed. In the early years at Plymouth Colony, there were harmonious relationships based on practical reasons. They needed each other. There was mutual respect, and the fur trade came with it. Despite fears and suspicions, there were moments of concord and mutual enjoyment. Squanto was an invaluable bridge between two cultures. The 3-day gathering of the natives and settlers in 1621 to celebrate the harvest would have been diplomatic, not social. It was a feast to celebrate the successful crops and included venison from the Wampanoags as well as local seafood and vegetables. This was recast as Thanksgiving 2½ centuries later. In November 1621, a new ship, the Fortune, arrived with 35 new settlers. All were put on 1/2 rations for most of the winter. Robert Cushman came as Thomas Weston's emissary and chastised the Pilgrims for sending the Mayflower back to England empty. With more ships arriving with no supplies and putting a strain on the colony, less friendly relations with the natives arose. The colony was also in competition for the fur trade with another English colony to the north, the Massachusetts. The relations deteriorated further as settlers occupied more and more land. Squanto, despite his great advantage to the English, began to boost his own power. After the second winter, Hobomac, another native living at the Plymouth colony, told the settlers not to go on a trading mission, as the Narragansetts and Massasoit were joining to eradicate Plymouth and had recruited Squanto to their cause. The settlers were not sure whom to trust, but Massasoit assured them that he was their ally and was offended by Squanto's deception. Squanto was playing his own game to achieve favor from other tribes, to whom he told that the English could send the plague, which they had in storage, wherever they wanted. Squanto was reprimanded by Bradford, but not punished, as he was needed. Massasoit was livid and sent messages to demand Squanto's execution, offering beaver skins in return for Squanto's head and hands. Bradford stated, "It was not the manner of the English to sell men's lives at a price." Squanto had to cleave to the settlers, but by now the settlers weren't trusting the Indians, although it was helpful to have both Squanto and Hobomoke as information sources. A trading expedition was navigated by Squanto around Cape Cod, but he developed a fever and died. He had told Bradford to pray that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. He had survived kidnappings, a slave market, ocean crossings, and Massasoit's call for execution. Now he had died in the company of English settlers who did not trust him, but he had been indispensable to them and was critical for their survival. Squanto had been a practical advisor and diplomat, not the savage that the myth portrayed. The Pilgrims had no Indian policy when they arrived. Tales of savagery had circulated in Europe, and they expected the worst. But Miles Standish would improvise a system of defense. For other relationships with the natives, they trusted in the Ten Commandments. They would attempt to behave with Christian charity towards the natives, and they expected to be treated with similar decency in return. All historical records were written by the English, and there was no attempt to understand Squanto or native culture. Some historians said Squanto was childish, but others spoke of his intellect and sophistication. Early Plymouth historian Judge John Davis was willing to grant him some usefulness to the enterprise. His useful services to the infant settlement entitle him to grateful remembrance. Without him, the development would have been difficult, if not impossible. The one thing that the natives had that the English wanted was land, and it grew to be a source of conflict. It was a sign of status for the English, but for the natives it was homeland. The English grew more aggressive about it as more and more ships arrived. Massasoit found himself in a weak bargaining position. When his son, Matacone, in 1675 launched King Philip's War, it foreshadowed 2 centuries of fighting as the Americans pushed further and further west, displacing hundreds of tribes. It was devastating. The native tribes in New England would never again control their destiny in their homeland. Roger Williams was briefly at Plymouth Colony, and believed that New England belonged to the native people. If the English wanted title to the land on which they had settled, he believed they should buy it from those who possessed it. Williams bought land from the Narragansetts. Many from the Salem colony joined him, and they called it Providence. William Bradford's writings of Plymouth Plantation represented keen perception of how the settlers perceived those early years. It took him 20 years to write, and some of the text is dark and turbulent. He died in 1657, but he shaped the story for the future. The book was lost, but was found much later in London and was republished and brought back to the State House in Massachusetts. 50 years ago, the Native American leader of the Wampanoags, Frank B. James, was invited to participate in the 350-year commemoration of the landing of the Mayflower, but an advance copy of his text caused the organizers to ask for a change, and he refused. Later, in 1970, marking the first gathering, he stated, "This action by Massasoit of the first gathering in 1621 was perhaps our biggest mistake. We, the Wampanoags, welcomed you, the white man, with open arms, little knowing that it was the beginning of the end." In planning for 2020's 400-year celebration, the Native Americans have actively shaped the programming, and the tribe is much involved as Enlightenment has changed attitudes. The exhibits on two sides of the Atlantic depict both sides of the history, and there has been close collaboration to make sure of accuracy, replacing the incorrect stories of the first meetings between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags. It is as it should be.